сейчас я бы хотел перейти к блоку тела и пригласить на сцену своего друга, благодаря которому мне удалось стать лектором на международных биохакинг-сообществах. Ровно год назад в Таллине я читал свою первую лекцию, где мы актуализировали вопрос, что же такое биохакинг. Потому что на самом деле в биохакинг-сообществе существует очень много разных мнений. Потому что каждый человек для себя решает, что такое для него биохакинг. Мало кто делает биохакинг для других, в основном биохакинг это делают люди для себя, и это на самом деле очень хорошо, что это не медицинская специальность, которую доктора навязывают другим людям. Это подход самого человека. И говорить мы будем о достаточно актуальных на сегодняшний день вопросах, они сейчас на хайпе, это кето-диета и интервальное голодание. И я приглашаю на эту сцену своего друга, автора книг о интервальном голодании и кето-диете, биохакера, международного опинион-лидера Сиима Ланда, Эстония.
Hello. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't speak much Ukrainian or Russian, so I'm gonna do it in English, and hopefully you can definitely, practice your own language skills in the making. So, thanks for SQLAB for inviting me into the event as well, and I'm quite happy to be in this part of the world and see that people are interested in this thing called biohacking. A little bit about myself. Well, I am like an author, and I have a podcast speaking gigs, and so on. And the kind of title of my speech is about cyclical ketosis and fasting for balancing the anabolic and catabolic sides of life. So maybe raise your hand if you've heard about this thing called the ketogenic diet. Yeah, a few. How about intermittent fasting? Autophagy. Yeah. So yeah, my speech is going to go into these topics, and I'm going to kind of teach you how do you actually implement these things into your life and how can you make them work for you. So yeah, I'm going to start the speech with a quote from Elon Musk, who has said, "I think you should bear in mind that entropy is not on your side." So entropy as a thing or as a phenomenon is this physical process that describes how living organisms as well as complex systems, they're constantly moving towards chaos, disorder, and disaster, basically. And in a way, it shows how life itself works. Like as a living organism, you're pretty much in this very structured way of living. Your body is functioning well, your metabolic processes are working correctly, but as you get older, entropy is going to catch up on you, and that's going to lead to this disaster, and you're dying. I hate to break it to you, but we're all dying gradually, but this doesn't have to become this source of turmoil or anxiety. Entropy is inevitable, but what we can do instead is to mitigate some of the processes and make sure that it doesn't become like a source of great anxiety. And I hope that my speech will give you some of the principles of how do you slow down this process. Because the problem is that as you do get older, you're going to lose a lot of the functionality of your body, such as there's the tendency of losing lean muscle mass as you get older, which leads to lack of muscle strength, muscle tone, and flexibility and joint strength. Then there's also loss of bone density, which again increases your chance of getting some sort of disease, such as arthritis or osteoporosis. And there's also degeneration of your cognitive faculties and mental processes. So all of those things are signs of entropy that are, in some aspects, inevitable, but at the same time, they're, you can alleviate them. Instead of, aging like most of the world does, I think a much better perspective would be to try to biohack it, and this is called squaring the curve. So most of the world is aging quite dysfunctionally. Like they start to show first signs of degeneration in their early adulthood already. Like how many people do you know who are in their 40s, they have back pain, they have cognitive functioning is going off rails, and they're basically finished. They're pretty much done for their life, and they're slowly degenerating. That's how most of the world is actually aging. They're not really that functional in their later life, and that shows in the society as well. A much better alternative would be to do this thing called squaring the curve, which describes this process that you can see on the green line, where you maintain high levels of functionality throughout your entire life, at least most of it, and then you go through this sharp descent and you drop down really fast in the later stages of life. That's a much better perspective because you're being able to stay healthy for longer, and you will also be more productive throughout your entire life years. And this is called squaring the curve. So as biohackers, some of the purpose of your healthy lifestyle habits is to just square the curve and slow down the process of entropy so that you could be youthful and younger for longer. So entropy itself manifests itself really nicely in your physical body and your entire life. So life itself sprouts into existence from DNA synthesis and cellular growth. This is called anabolism, or it's the anabolic state of growing and replicating. This is the opposite of entropy. You're not breaking down, but you're actually growing and being youthful. The other side of the coin is actually entropy, where life slowly degrades. And this is where you experience atrophy, muscle loss, and deterioration. So this state is called catabolism, the opposite of anabolism. And these things, they're pretty much reflecting each other on a kind of cyclical basis. As when you're young, you're growing, you're anabolic, and as you get older, you experience more catabolism and more entropy. In the metabolism, these things are constantly balancing each other out. So for example, catabolism is the process of breaking down larger molecules into smaller ones. And this describes things like digestion, eating food, breaking them down, absorbing the nutrients, even fat burning and exercising. Those are somewhat catabolic processes. You're breaking down things to produce energy, and that energy gets created in the state of anabolism, where those smaller molecules are being put into use, like you're building muscle, you're nourishing your body, and in turn, that can lead to an additional state of catabolism. So these are like the yin and yang of your body. One side is the breaking down, and the other side is the proliferation and growth aspect. So they can't really coexist at the same time, but they just constantly being cycled on a daily basis inside your body's processes. And which side is the predominant one depends on a lot of what kind of signals are you sending to your body, what kind of nutrients are you consuming, and what kind of other activities are you doing on a daily basis and on a cyclical basis. You would think that in order to avoid entropy and live longer, then you want to just be in this anabolic state all the time and keep growing. You would think that, but there are actually a lot of beneficial sides to catabolism and the actual process of breaking down. So one of the few known ways of promoting lifespan virtually in all species is calorie restriction. So if animals are fed less food, then they tend to live longer just because their body is very efficient with the nutrients that it gets access to. So this graph describes how calorie restriction extends lifespan in rhesus monkeys. So for example, as you can see, fully fed monkeys, they live quite an average life, but as you keep reducing their calorie intake, they're going to see an exponential increase in their lifespan, and even up to 10 to 50% increased in lifespan. So that's why it's not always that good to be in this anabolic state. The aspect of catabolism and breakdown has many benefits that actually increase your lifespan and make you live longer. And this is described very well in many other species as well, such as yeast, roundworms, mice, and even humans potentially as well. And the reason it does happen is because of several things, such as the increase of these longevity proteins called sirtuins, and improved mitochondrial functioning, and many other things that make the body function more optimally and produce its energy more efficiently. All of those reasons kind of converge together into this thing called autophagy that is the kind of central component to why calorie restriction extends your lifespan. And for instance, if mice or yeast are genetically modified in a way that doesn't activate autophagy in their body, then they're not going to live longer, even if they are put under calorie restriction, versus those mice that do have normal levels of autophagy activated, those mice will still live longer when they are put under calorie restriction. So the reason why calorie restriction extends your lifespan has to do a lot with this process of autophagy. And the kind of goal as biohackers shouldn't be to try to starve yourself all the time. The goal is to try to find this optimal amount of autophagy as to gain the benefits of calorie restriction without necessarily restricting your calories. And this is where it's very smart to know what kind of ways can I promote autophagy with, and how can I mitigate some of the negative side of calorie restriction, because it can still have like negative side effects. So what is autophagy? Autophagy translates from Greek into self-digestion or eating of self. And essentially it's this process where your healthy cells are recycling all the old and worn-out material that are inside you. And those things, this cellular debris, waste material, that tends to accumulate inside your body as you get older. It's inevitable that your cells get old and they just sit around there. And with autophagy, you can help to clear out those cells. And in so doing, you will just maintain your youthfulness for longer. And autophagy as a process, as a mechanism, helps organisms to survive cellular stress and survive these periods of energy deprivation and starvation. So your body goes into this mode of self-eating just so it could survive for longer. Some additional benefits of autophagy include you reduce your inflammation levels, you will strengthen your immune system, it has some anti-aging benefits, longevity boosting benefits, it can fight certain cancerous cells, malignant cells, tumors, eliminates some pathogens, and essentially you're just healing the diseased and the weak tissues of your body. This is somewhat of a technical slide, but I'm gonna break it down for you. So autophagy, or your body, is constantly monitoring the nutrient status of itself. So imagine that if you are a living organism in the wild, in the savanna, then you can't really opt to choose when do you grow or when do you break down your tissue. You would always have to base those decisions around the nutrient availability. So if you get access to enough food, enough calories, then you can grow because it's safer to do so, versus if your body is experiencing starvation or famine, then it can't grow because there's no nutrients around. So the smarter thing would be to, in that situation, to go into autophagy. So that's why your body has developed these different nutrient sensing pathways for detecting the presence of nutrients. For example, AMPK is the nutrient sensor that gets activated when you are experiencing energy deprivation and starvation and energy stress. In that situation, AMPK gets activated, and this leads to the activation of another pathway called ULK1, which then turns on autophagy. So autophagy gets activated when you're deprived of certain nutrients, such as amino acids and carbohydrates and glucose. So this is the energy starvation pathway. On the opposite hand, when AMPK gets suppressed, you get access to sufficient amounts of energy, you're getting enough amino acids and glucose, then in that situation, your body turns on mTOR, or mechanistic target of rapamycin. So mTOR is the growth pathway, the anabolic pathway that makes your body proliferate and replicate cells, repair tissue, and grow. And mTOR and AMPK can't coexist the same with anabolism and catabolism. When you're being catabolic, then you have AMPK activated and you activate autophagy. But if you're anabolic, then AMPK is suppressed and you activate mTOR instead, which then leads to cell growth. So those things can't activate at the same time. They're being balanced constantly. So how do you activate autophagy? Like I mentioned, energy starvation is probably the most important aspect of activating autophagy. And to do so, you can do things like fasting, not eating anything, exercising, and even calorie restriction activates autophagy to a certain extent. Then, of course, there's the low-carb ketogenic diets that also mimic a lot of the same effects of autophagy without necessarily having to fast, because a low-carb ketogenic diet doesn't have extra carbohydrates in its menu, and therefore you're suppressing insulin, you're suppressing mTOR to a certain extent, and you're still gaining some of the benefits from calorie restriction without necessarily being in that deprived state. And lastly, there are some autophagy activating foods even that also stimulate this pathway without having to fast. And a few examples of them include things like cayenne pepper, black pepper. They stimulate autophagy. Then medicinal mushrooms like chaga, reishi, cordyceps, coffee, black coffee, herbal teas, cruciferous vegetables, elderberries, blueberries, apple cider vinegar, and turmeric and berberine. They're also stimulating the pathway of autophagy by suppressing insulin, suppressing mTOR, and activating AMPK. So they're mimicking some fasting. So you don't have to starve all the time to gain the benefits of autophagy. When you look at the contemporary eating habits of modern society, then you can see that it's not really that pro-autophagy. Like, you're pretty much never gaining significant amounts of autophagy if you're eating like 3 square meals a day and you're having a bunch of carbohydrates and a bunch of extra calories. And the problem is that this, when you're eating in the morning, you have like a breakfast bowl of Cheerios or some oatmeal or something, then you're going to raise your blood sugar, you're going to raise insulin, and that is also going to raise mTOR. And this, in turn, will just suppress autophagy, and you're not really helping your body to heal itself. You're not really repairing itself. Because, like I mentioned, autophagy and mTOR can't coexist. If you activate mTOR by raising insulin, then you're suppressing autophagy, and you're not getting that. So part of the reason I think that in modern society there is so many kind of metabolic disorders and nutritional diseases is that people are, they're eating extra calories, but they're also doing it very frequently. They're staying in this state of fed, and they're staying in this anabolic state all the time. So they're never allowing their body to heal itself by going into autophagy. So it's not only, like, it doesn't matter only what you eat, but it also matters when you eat and how often you eat, because autophagy is like a very central component to clearing out some of the pathogens and diseases inside your body. So if you are eating 3 square meals a day over the span of 12 hours or so, then you may get some autophagy in the evening or in the nighttime when you're sleeping. But at the same time, it's not that much. It's like a very small amount compared to spiking your insulin several times throughout the entire day. So you spike your insulin in the morning, you may go dip it down by lunch, but you spike it again, and you spike it again in the evening, so you're never really gaining significant amounts of autophagy. You're keeping your body in this anabolic state without ever experiencing the benefits of catabolism. And if you were to just take out one meal, then the situation would be completely different. You would experience longer periods of low insulin and low mTOR and higher autophagy. So if you were to skip one meal, whether that be breakfast or dinner, then you extend the periods where your body is healing itself and clearing out the trash. And this is an example of a very convenient and popular way of doing intermittent fasting. You fast for about 16 hours every day, and you eat your food within 8 hours. So in practice, it means just skipping out one meal. And by doing that, you extend the period of low insulin and low mTOR and increasing the autophagy. So you can even consume the same amount of calories as you would with the previous way of eating, but just because you're confining the time period of when you eat, you're getting drastically more autophagy. You can even eat the same food, the same amount of food, but you're getting a completely different metabolic response by changing the time of when you eat and how frequently you do it. And of course, you can take it even a bit further by fasting for about 20 hours and eating once a day. But the difference between 2 meals a day versus 1 meal a day isn't that big. Like you still get some autophagy here. The difference may be just you will gain a bit more, but it's not like that necessary. So I'm not trying to tell which one is better or not. The main idea is that less frequent meals and less snacking in general, that can be just more useful for increased autophagy and increased cellular clearance. But the problem is that autophagy is really good and it's very essential, but it has some negative side effects as well. For example, autophagy is a catabolic process of breakdown. So if you're staying in autophagy for too long, or you're staying there for all the time, then eventually you're going to break down your own tissue. You're speeding up entropy and deterioration. So that's why it's never a good idea to kind of go all in with one side. You don't want to be in anabolism all the time, but you don't want to be in catabolism either for too long. And like I mentioned earlier, as you get older, you start to lose your muscle tissue. And muscle mass is a vital component to healthy aging and longevity because it helps you to increase your metabolic rate. It increases your ability to tolerate carbohydrates. You can eat more calories without getting fat. And it will also just improve your functionality throughout your entire lifetime, such as you'll be able to lift stuff, you'll be able to move around, exercise, and all those things are very important for longevity. And the problem is that as you get older, your muscle mass is also deteriorating constantly. And usually it starts to happen in the later parts of your adulthood. Like your muscle mass and strength tend to peak in early life, and since that time, it's going to slowly decrease. And it's not going to be like necessary to happen. You can still avoid it by being smart with your diet and still exercising until the very last parts of your life. So age-related muscle loss is called sarcopenia, and it's associated with many diseases, nutritional diseases, metabolic syndrome, and just dysfunction in general. So physical activity is quite important. And the worst part about it is that you're not actually even losing weight. You're just replacing the muscle tissue with the fat tissue. And the more fat you have, the more potential you have for getting sick and dying sooner. So muscle tissue is just very functional, and it's very important to maintain it for longer. So on the left, you have a healthy muscle that is for a young person, and on the right, you have an old person's muscle that tends to be sarcopenic. Like you can see that the muscle tissue has been replaced with fat instead. And fat doesn't have like a huge amount of functional benefit up to a certain point. It's not going to help you to stay active. With autophagy, the optimal amount for it depends a lot on what kind of stimuli are you exposing yourself to. So if you're experiencing too much autophagy, then that will inevitably lead to muscle breakdown and muscle loss. So that's why you don't want to overdo it. You don't want to fast for too long, or you don't want to eat too little food. You want to nourish your body to a certain point to maintain muscle mass. But on the other hand, if you're not experiencing that much autophagy, then that can also lead to some muscle loss because your body is not able to cope with the energy stress. So if you're constantly being fed, then your body is very kind of lazy. It gets lazy in a sense of how do you actually use your own body fat for energy. So the optimal amount tends to be somewhere in the middle. Not enough is bad, but too much is also bad. And the same applies to anabolism, you can find later. So how do you prevent muscle breakdown? Muscle building or muscle maintenance is controlled by mTOR. And as I said, mTOR is the growth pathway that triggers muscle protein synthesis, which is the phenomenon of building muscle tissue and maintaining it. And mTOR is regulated primarily by amino acids. The main amino acid is leucine, and insulin and IGF-1, which are primarily regulated by carbohydrates. So carbohydrates from glucose and amino acids from protein are the most responsible for growth and the muscle growth. IGF-1 is also somewhat, it has a dark side in the sense that it's a double-edged sword. So it has a lot of functional benefits like increased muscle mass, increased metabolism, bone strength and cognition, but at the same time, it is associated with things like cancer, aging, and general disease. So again, too much IGF-1 may lead to some issues, but not enough IGF-1 will also definitely cause some problems by deteriorating your muscle mass and making you more vulnerable to entropy. So some studies find that the association with IGF-1 and mortality follows a U-shaped curve. So in this graph, in this study, they actually found that lower levels of IGF-1 tend to be more associated with death than high levels of IGF-1. So again, the answer tends to be somewhere in the middle. You don't want too much, but you don't want too little either. And the same applies to autophagy. So you have to find this balance of how can I get enough of the beneficial aspects of autophagy and catabolism without sacrificing my muscle mass, while at the same time nourishing my body with enough mTOR stimulation and with enough IGF-1. And I think that can be achieved very easily with things like this. Like you're still eating every day, you're still getting a lot of the nutrients, but confining the timing of when you eat just a little bit can enable you to get still the baseline levels of autophagy every day. And you don't necessarily have to starve, and you won't be overfeeding yourself. So you're maintaining the balance between these two sides of enough mTOR and enough autophagy. So this is called, you can call it intermittent fasting, or you can call it time-restricted eating. And the idea is that you confine your eating window within certain hours, whether that be 8 hours, whether that be 10 hours. It's still better than all the time eating. It's still better than staying in this fed state constantly. Let's move on. So what foods do stimulate mTOR? I mentioned the ones that stimulate autophagy. So mTOR is stimulated primarily by protein and carbohydrates. The most powerful foods for that tend to be like protein powders, eggs, meat, dairy, fish, and even some carbohydrates. So these are the quote-unquote anabolic foods of growth that make your body grow and repair and build muscle. So you don't necessarily want to overeat them, but you don't want to undereat them either. So there tends to be, again, a balance between the autophagy foods and these foods. When it comes to ketosis and carb cycling, then this is a perfect example of balancing autophagy and mTOR. So when you are eating a low-carb diet, then you tend to be more catabolic and you tend to be activating autophagy more. Versus if you're eating a high-carb diet, then that leads you more towards anabolism and growth. So it's, again, I think it's a smart idea to never be on one side for too long. You don't want to be in ketosis all the time, and you don't want to be eating a bunch of carbs all the time either. You want to go through periods of low-carb intake, followed by some higher carb intake, just so you can keep on cycling yourself, and you wouldn't be able to, or you wouldn't suffer from lack of autophagy or too much mTOR. So carb cycling is a prime example of the same process that I just alluded to, that you're enabling your body to clear out the cells while at the same time being able to sustain yourself and build muscle tissue. Lastly, the foods themselves, it's still a good idea to always be eating something that doesn't have a bunch of extra calories, because some aspects of calorie restriction are good for longevity. Like in one of the earlier slides, the less food animals eat, the longer they tend to live. And the same applies to humans to a certain extent. So underfeeding yourself is definitely not a good idea, but overfeeding yourself is also somewhat bad. So the main kind of Goldilocks zone can be achieved by just eating some of the nutrient-dense foods that have high satiety, but they don't have like a bunch of extra calories. Because if you do experience calorie restriction, then you have to make sure that you don't become nutrient deficient. You want to get all of the essential nutrients, all the vitamins and minerals, so that you could actually go through the essential metabolic processes. So calorie restriction works only if you don't deprive yourself from the vitamins and minerals that your body needs. So that's why it's important to focus on these essential nutrients that you can get from foods, such as organ meats are one of the best foods for that, like liver, heart, kidneys, pancreas, these very unconventional foods. They're actually the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet. Like liver, one piece of liver can give you all of the nutrients that your body needs for the entire day. Like the vitamin A, vitamin C to a certain extent, and others. So organ meats are probably the best foods that you can ever eat. Then things like egg yolks, fatty fish, some meat, tubers, and vegetables. So these are somewhat, it's a good blend of autophagy activating foods and mTOR boosting foods. You're able to activate muscle protein synthesis, and you're also promoting autophagy and mild calorie restriction. On the other hand, you want to avoid foods that have a bunch of extra calories, but they don't have virtually no, they have virtually no nutritional value, or they don't have the essential nutrients. So things like donuts, pastries, margarine, oil, they're very high in calories, but they don't have a lot of the vitamins and minerals. So these things you can eat, and never be really satiated from them, versus if you were to eat only just a handful of broccoli or a handful of meat, then you would be satiated much faster from that, and you would get all the essential nutrients, versus this can lead to excess calories, and this can lead to obesity and overactivation of mTOR and so on. So this is a spectrum that you can kind of gravitate towards, always kind of trying to lean on the left side as to enable your body to function optimally. And this is also my last slide, so thanks for listening. I have a few minutes till the end of my speech, so is it okay, or shall we have any? Okay, all right. Well, thanks for listening. If you have any questions, then you can reach out to me on social media or check out my website as well. Thanks.